Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ilias Grampas, and on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event, where we'll be addressing ways with regards to strengthening EU and global climate preparedness, stepping on some extremely interesting and important project findings, and also leading to concrete policy responses. So for all that, we have a very good set of panelists. We have speakers from the two various projects. We have policymakers from the EU. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. I know it's a very busy week, so thank you very much for that. Concerning the topic of the event, I just wanted to say that, of course, we all know that the polar regions are the most susceptible to global warming. So this event will step on this exact fact. We'll also have a look into the different environmental shifts and how they impact infrastructure, energy, global trade, natural disaster preparation, and more. And I think I'm sure it will come as a key takeaway of the event, but I think it's extremely important towards this direction to support research and innovation, to support more scientific data, and to really boost our fundraising, our funding commitments for research towards this direction. And all in all, as we're going to address both the level from the EU side, but also international dimension, from the global dimension, I don't think we could have a better suited MEP to lead the discussion as our host of today's event. Mr. Urmas Paet is coming from Estonia. He's an MEP since 2014, and he's also vice chair of the Alfred committee and co-chair of the Arctic Working Group of the European Parliament Intergroup. So, Mr. Paet, it's an honor to have you with us today. So with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and welcome to the European Parliament. Well, I'm glad that I have the chance to invite you also to come to this house and discuss here issues related to developments in polar areas, including Arctic area, which is clearly also, of course, part of Europe. I will not, in this sense, have my starting monologue in very detailed issues, because we have here excellent experts and specialists during next couple of hours to deliver their overviews and analyses. But actually, what I'd like to say in the beginning is that, of course, Arctic area and Arctic developments, including, of course, climate and climate changes, it's very fundamental basics of also many other developments, be it in the field of economy, be it in the field of security, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, because of some other events, also in Europe and globally, the attention on what is happening in Arctic and what are the reasons and how to try to change the situation. Unfortunately, during a couple of last years, I noticed that the attention is not what it should be. Of course, one is that there is war in Europe, and lots of attention goes because of Russian aggression against Ukraine to these issues. And of course, there is also impact, for example, to energy and energy prices. And here also we see clear link to Arctic issues. We see that Arctic Council is basically not able to work because of the same war, so that lots of issues which have also political touch or security touch, at the moment it's impossible to discuss it as it should be. Countries like Russia, for example, but more and more also with China, which is of course not in the Arctic Council, but calls itself as near Arctic country. Although I have my personal doubts that China is very much interested in Arctic developments because of climate change and the environment. I guess that there are good other reasons, which are not exactly on the same line why we are concerned. But the fact is that the cooperation in and around Arctic between the countries and between all stakeholders is, because of other events, much more complicated today than it was, for instance, 2 years ago. And it, of course, I guess also you have the same, not just impression, but also practical, well, experience that, for example, cooperation with scientists from Russia, it's at the moment collapsed. There is non-existent anymore. At the same time, if we look at practical Russian policies or also Chinese policies vis-à-vis Arctic, then there is good reason to be worried, be it about, well, shipping and oil transit on the Arctic waters, for instance, or increasing military build-up in Arctic region and so on and so on. Plus then, of course, the necessary or lack of necessary attention and action what concerns Arctic region. Well, but the situation is as it is, and it means that we in Europe, in the European Union, plus our other good friends in Europe who are not in the EU, be it Norway or be it Iceland, for instance, we should, I guess, also on political level, scientific level anyway, but also on political level, of course, increase the cooperation in Arctic issues, for example, with the countries like US and Canada. So it means that we should do what we can do under all these circumstances. And the other point is, of course, the issue of awareness. What is happening in Arctic, which are the reasons and which are the impacts and what we can do about this. So the awareness in our all European societies, I guess still we have here long, well, road to go. My feeling is that although 2, 3, 4 years ago situation started to be better in this regard, but again, because of all these other dramatic events in Europe, it's not that much under the attention anymore again. So it means that yes, awareness should be there, because of without needed level of awareness, it's also very difficult to imagine that, well, political level or political elites of the European countries pay enough attention to these issues. And finally, I guess also the policymakers in Europe and also certain interest groups, of course, have to be a bit more fair also to, how to say, to our own European actors in Arctic, because I just saw that again, new wave of criticism against Norway is there. But at the same time, well, the real and serious impact already actually comes from the same Russian activities together with China and even from, well, US and others. But it's very, of course, convenient to criticize a very civilized country. So that in this sense, I think that also the credibility of Arctic policies can be stronger if also, for instance, the criticism and this kind of approach is also more fair, so that in this sense, the countries in Arctic region and who have activities with also different level of responsibility are also treated more equally than it is at the moment. It is my maybe subjective feeling, but I guess we need, I mean, the EU also needs strong partners in the face of Norway and Iceland in this region. And I personally have no doubts that all the criteria what Norway is doing in Arctic area is, well, the highest quality level you can find in the world. So, well, I sum up here my starting monologue, and the main issue for me, yes, is that climate and climate change in Arctic has tremendous consequences also for the security picture, for the, well, economic picture, and it's but the basics, of course, is still the changes in nature and environment, and here also our main peak of attention and positive activities should be. But everything begins with knowledge, and that's why also we have very knowledgeable people around this table who will enlighten us within the next few hours. Once again, thank you for joining, and of course, as always, fruitful and good discussions are warmly welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paet, for your commitment, but also for setting the scene with regards to the discussion to follow. I think within your intro remarks, you were extremely successful in connecting all the various puzzle pieces of recent developments, but also highlighting the need for further attention, but also action when it comes to our polar regions. Just to reply to some comments received through the platform, my colleague Regine has already done it in writing, but just to let people in the room know as well. The event is indeed being recorded, and the presentations following the green light of speakers will be shared with our audience as well. So looking ahead into the discussion, we'll be starting with some presentations with regards to the key project findings and some policy recommendations, perhaps. So our first speaker is Dr. Michael Karcher, Project Coordinator of Arctic Passion and Senior Scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute.
Yeah, thank you very much. A warm welcome to all the guests. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak about Arctic Passion and for making time to be interested in our project. Arctic Passion is a project which is aiming at collaborating towards an observing system that serves society's needs in a future Arctic. Next slide. In fact, the Arctic warms even faster than the global mean as a consequence of global climate change. Here you can see an example of temperature time series put together by based on four different assessments of centers. In the colored version, you can see the Arctic temperatures from 1950 to 2021. And in the brownish colors, you can see the global mean temperature development. And it's easy to depict that the Arctic is rising in air temperatures much faster than the rest of the globe. This, of course, has serious consequences, massive consequences for the environmental system, including the physical one, the ecosystem, and the humans. Next slide, please. The most visible effect of this climate change in the Arctic may be the disappearance of summer sea ice. We already have lost about a third of the summer sea ice in the past decades. In the greenish numbers, you can see the development based on satellite records, and that's the green stippled line. And the permanent line shows you results from a climate model, one of the suite of the models of the IPCC, in this case from the UK Met Office. And it shows that indeed in the projection into the future, we expect a much increased diminishing of the sea ice, and we have to expect an ice-free summer in the Arctic following the mid of this century. And this is the case for all emission scenarios. So we really need to prepare ourselves for what's coming along. Next slide. The Arctic is not isolated, however. Also, Europe, North America, and Asia will be impacted. There's a strong interaction between the polar regions and the mid-latitudes. This means mitigation and adaptation to the consequences demand decision-making that is based on the best available information. And this means we need knowledge on the state and recent development of the Arctic environment. We need systemic knowledge on how the environmental system works, including the human component. We need sound forecasts and projections, all of which depend on observations, of course. Next slide. However, the Arctic is undersampled. The data coverage is sparse. This is an example from ocean drifters taken from the GOOSE, Global Ocean Observing System, website for April 2022, just as one snapshot. And it shows on the top of the picture that the Arctic Ocean, in particular the high Arctic, is strongly undersampled in comparison to other ocean regions further south. So the requirements for knowledge-based decision-making are better data coverage. We need less fragmentation of observing activities, data that are accessible and interoperable. We need a more systemic or more holistic and more equitable approach to Arctic observing. and we need information products that are tailored to societal needs. The EU has realized these problems, thankfully, and invested in Arctic research, Arctic observing system projects and services. And I'm going to report, next slide, please, on Arctic Passion, which is one of those projects. It's a 4-year project which started in 2021. It is a large project. We have more than 40 partner institutions and indigenous communities in our team. The project is running until 2025 and comprises partners from 18 countries. And of course, we are also collaborating with other institutions outside of the project. Next slide. So this is the list of our institutional partners, just to get an idea of how many we are. Next slide, please. We are particularly proud and grateful for the collaboration with the indigenous communities. This is a snapshot of those communities we are working with. The 3 ones you can see in Russia, we have had to stop working with after the Russian war, which was launched against Ukraine. Next slide, please. Arctic Passion is working on quite a large number of fields. And since time is tight, I can only give you a few examples of activities we are doing, we are working in. So I will focus here on the enhancement of observations and of coordination, on bringing the Arctic data system into action. So that is on interoperability issues. Next slide. On inclusion issues, so to come up with a more holistic approach to Arctic observing, including different ways of knowing, and on information needs. I'm going to present examples from our Arctic Passion services and on subnational policymaking support. Next slide, please. So to start with the enhancing of the instrumentation and coordination, on the top left and right, you can see 2 examples for our activities. I should mention that Arctic Passion is active on the terrestrial and the marine sphere, as well as cryosphere and atmosphere. The 2 examples shown here on the left-hand side are from the Interact project, which is a partner in our team, where we are supporting the deployment and structuring of observations, in particular in the western part of the Arctic, on the terrestrial sphere. And on the right-hand side, you see an example put together by our partners at the Norwegian Polar Institute, who are also leading our work package on observations, with drifter deployments in the European Arctic. And we are working here not only with drifters, but also fixed installations, sensor and instrumentation development, which are all important aspects of enhanced observations. On the bottom, you can see an example for a coordination activity we are involved in, actually launching it. Arctic Passion has been proud to launch the ADBO, the Atlantic Arctic Distributed Biological Observatory, which in fact is a multidisciplinary environmental observatory in the European Arctic, shown here in yellowish colors. It is meant to combine the activities of many nations active in this region in a coordinated fashion to derive long time series on key locations in the Arctic. And we are collaborating here with 3 other DBOs, which are active in other regions of the Arctic, the Pacific, the East Siberian region, and Davis Strait, Baffin Bay. Next slide, please. I should have mentioned also one other important activity we are involved in is the formation process of an Arctic Ocean Coordination Initiative, an Arctic Goose Regional Alliance on the long run, which will be a very important asset for coordinated Arctic research. We are in the field of enhancing inclusion of different knowledge systems, active in supporting and feeding the Arctic Seas.org platform, which is a platform advancing the visibility of indigenous marine knowledge. This is an activity done by our partner Snow Change from Finland, together with the indigenous communities I've shown on the first slide, or one of the first slides. Arctic Passion is also active in piloting the development of SAON's shared Arctic variables approach. Some of you may be familiar with the essential climate variables, which are important indicators for long-term climate change and have a more global perspective. The shared Arctic variables are strongly regional and local and are in the end meant to empower local and indigenous communities to better handle certain problems they are encountering locally. Arctic Passion is active here on the themes of wildfire, permafrost, and sea ice. Next slide, please. In terms of the data system, which is a very important part of all the observations done in the Arctic to make them accessible and usable by all kinds of stakeholders, we are working on mapping the polar data system, the transformation of data into standardized form, which is the key to actually make data interoperable on a machine reading scene. Fair data and service provision, we are working on long-term data preservation, and we are working with the SAON data portal in terms of data center harvesting to make it accessible by many users. Next slide, please. So just a few examples now from the services we are developing, which are meant to support emergency preparedness, food security, and the response to the changes in the Arctic. Arctic Passion is developing, led by Snow Change and the indigenous communities, and 6 of our indigenous communities, a self-governed database of community-based monitoring, oral histories, and indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, meant to document events which are happening in the local regions of those communities. We are developing a permafrost service that is done by the RV Group in Potsdam, which will deliver localized information on landscape changes due to permafrost thawing to inhabitants and also to research. We are developing a web platform at NPI, which is capturing key elements of the state of the Arctic environment. Next slide. We are working on a service which is deriving or providing an integrated fire risk management, which is particularly focusing on better information for the local population in impacted regions, a local atmospheric pollutant forecast service, and one which is improving the safety for shipping in the polar seas by enhancing the Polaris network. Next slide. And the 2 last ones I'm presenting here is one in Greenland, in Karnak, where with local hunters and fishers, we are developing a noise pollution and impacts on marine living resources service, which is coordinated by the Greenland Institute for Nature Research and DMI, and a lake ice service installed by Syke in Finland for lake ice documentation in Scandinavia. Next slide. So on the field of policy making, we are doing policy and decision-making support on many levels. One of these is the subnational level. And here, this is an example done by our colleagues at the Arctic Center in Rovaniemi on consultations they had with subnational decision makers in different countries and nations around the Arctic, which is aiming at identifying their needs in terms of observations, and on the other hand, also identifying what data can they provide into the overall Pan-Arctic data systems. That's a collaboration we are doing a lot with the Arctic Mayors Forum. And the last slide, please. So to sum up, the rapidly changing Arctic environment that impacts the livelihood of The rapidly changing Arctic environment impacts the livelihood of people living in the Arctic and societies outside the Arctic. This requires access to the most recent and most relevant environmental data and knowledge. And this calls for a sustained long-term observation and information set of services, which are based on the needs and requirements of inhabitants, stakeholders, and scientists. And we are happy that there is support from the EU on this, but we pledge for a sustained support of these activities by the European Parliament and the European Commission. Sustained funding and political support by the EU for better coordination of pan-Arctic observing and dissemination of relevant data is also an important aspect in this context, as well as changes in the funding and decision-making structure to make the Arctic observing system more equitable and more inclusive. And last but not least, an agreed framework for harmonized data and an enhancement of data interoperability and accessibility is necessary, and to put more force into this for all the services which are provided. Thank you very much. And the last slide is just the final one.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your work, but also for sharing with us your concrete project findings, including needs, requirements, and policy recommendations. I'm sure that this information has also served well to stimulate the discussion with policymakers in the room today. And as from the Secretariat side, we also want to promote well-informed and science-based policymaking. It's with great pleasure to have you with us today, as it is the case also for Ruth and Andrew. And Ruth is a project coordinator of Ocean Ice, working at the Danish Meteorological Institute, and the initiator of the project. And Andrew is a senior scientist at the British Antarctic Survey. I know that you have a presentation for us today, but I just wanted to also let you know that seamlessly, Ruth and Andrew will be moderating the panel discussion to follow. So I'm very happy to give you the floor. And meanwhile, as we want to have a discussion that is lively and interactive, attendees in the room, you can reflect on some questions for panelists. These will be able to take during the Q&A session. That goes out, of course, as well to attendees connected online. I've noticed that there's more than 80 people that are following us through WebEx. So you can also pose your questions via the chat box of the platform. So that's all from me, and happy to give the floor to Ruth and Andrew.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. So as Elias has said, I'm the coordinator of Ocean Ice, and Andrew is going to take over and talk a lot more about the sort of practicalities of what we're actually doing in the project. It's quite a large project, and we started just over a year ago, so we're still in that data gathering phase. I would like to start with a story, because I think stories are important. They tell us something about the environment, and I'm going to try and keep it brief because we don't have so much time. This is a story about the Antarctic, but it could also be a story about the Arctic because we see similar things going on in both polar regions. Could I have the next slide, please? So what you're seeing on the screen is actually a computer simulation of an extreme weather event that happened in March 2022 over East Antarctica. This is an area that is much bigger than Europe, and incredible temperatures. This is the kind of thing. I'm a climate scientist in Denmark, and I run computer simulations like this. When we see things like this happening, we tend to swear at our computers and say, this is impossible. If I could have the next slide, please. Fortunately, we actually have data from this event, and I say fortunately because there are surprisingly few observations from Antarctica. It's extremely data sparse, but this event, this big bubble of warm air that came over the East Antarctic, passed right over the French-Italian Concordia station at Dome Sea. And it's actually a new world record. The temperature was 38.5 degrees above what it should have been at that time of year. So this was a really, really extreme event. And that event had consequences. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk you through this slide. This is a satellite image from ESA's Sentinel-2 satellite. It's an optical satellite, so it doesn't see through clouds. This is just before that big warm air hit the Antarctic. And what you're looking at here, the black stuff is water. This is ocean water. You've got a big white flat area sticking out. That's an ice shelf. That's the Konga ice shelf. And this ice shelf had been getting progressively thinner and smaller, but it was still there. And an ice shelf is floating. It's not contributing to sea level rise when it's in place because it's already floating in the water. At the bottom of the image where it's sort of white and maybe you can see a little bluish, grayish color, that's actually the ice sheet, the Antarctic ice sheet. That is not floating, that is on land. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is in the middle of that event, and what you can see here is that the ice shelf has gone. It just disappeared over about 2 days during this extreme event that hit East Antarctica. This is a satellite that can see through clouds. This is Sentinel-1, and so the black stuff you're seeing is actually meltwater. This is a large amount of meltwater on the surface of the ice sheet. So this was a really extreme event that had consequences on the ice sheet and on the shelf. Can I have the next slide, please? This is just after that event. The white stuff you can see in the sea is sea ice. This was going into the winter season. The sea ice was starting to form. The ice shelf is not going to form again. It was already vulnerable, and this event was basically a tipping point that pushed it over the edge. Can I have the next slide? I would like to draw your attention. So this is the edge of the ice sheet as it enters the water. Can I have the next slide, please? The arrow is pointing at icebergs. So when I pulled this up this week to look at, I measured these icebergs. They're about 1 kilometer long, roughly 1 cubic kilometer of ice, each one of those large fragments that are floating off into the Southern Ocean. About 360 gigatons, 360 cubic kilometers leads to 1 millimeter of global mean sea level rise. So we now have a situation where this glacier was moving into an ice shelf. It was nice and stable. It wasn't doing very much. The ice shelf has gone. And now we have a glacier that is moving directly into the ocean, and it's directly having a consequence on our sea level. There will be other knock-on consequences in the ecology of the area. So these sort of weather events, they have a consequence beyond the actual event itself. And can I have the next slide, please? So I started with the climate simulation. The climate simulation is the last part of this story, actually. This was made maybe a few weeks after the actual event. What we want to be able to do is to foresee when these events are going to happen. We want to get better projections of what's happening now in near real time. And we're looking now also at digital twins. Can we see these things coming? Can we start to prepare better for these kind of extreme events? I mentioned at the start that this happened in Antarctica. By sheer coincidence, almost exactly the same thing was happening in Greenland and in Svalbard at exactly the same time. It was actually raining in March in Greenland in 2022. And I think Inutek can tell us how unusual that is for northern Greenland to see those kind of temperatures. So the polar regions are changing really very fast, and they have consequences for us also. I'm going to hand over to Andrew to talk a little bit more about what we plan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Could I have the next slide, please? So Ruth has illustrated the massive changes happening around Antarctica, and now I'll illustrate why these matter to us here in Europe. So Antarctica and the surrounding Southern Ocean really are at the centre of the world and very much at the centre of the global climate system, largely because this is where the oceans can communicate with one another, and very importantly, it's where the deep ocean can communicate with the atmosphere. Could I have the next slide, please? And that communication with the atmosphere is critical for the exchange of heat and carbon. This graph from the IPCC a few years ago shows the last 40 years of human-induced climate change and where that heat has ended up in the global system. The 1.5 degrees of atmospheric warming that we talk about when we talk about the Paris Accord, that represents less than 2%. That's that very thin red line, very at the bottom of that graph. That is less than 2% of the global energy imbalance driven by humans. 90% is in the oceans. And so we very much care about the processes that move that heat from the atmosphere into the ocean. If that changes, that will have massive consequences for our global climate. Next slide, please. And it's around the Southern Ocean that that heat and carbon gets into the global ocean. The unique circulation, largely driven by the winds and the fact the presence of the frozen Antarctic continent to the south, means deep water that hasn't seen the atmosphere for hundreds of years is brought up to the surface where it sees human-induced change, warmer atmospheres, more carbon, and takes that up and actually injects that back into the intermediate layers of the ocean, storing that heat and carbon for decades to centuries. And it's around Antarctica that this largely happens. And if you want to put numbers on this, roughly a gigaton 1 billion tonnes of carbon is actually being taken up every year around the Southern Ocean. And at today's carbon prices, that's approximately a climate service of 80 billion euros per year. So understanding how this may change in the presence of climate change is obviously critical for understanding how the changes in the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic will impact our environment here for the North. Next slide, please. And so the Antarctic ice sheet is melting, as Ruth has very visibly demonstrated. And a lot of this is happening in the West Antarctic. This is showing from satellites basically how the ice sheet has thinned. The red is showing thinning. And you see it's very much concentrated on the left-hand side there. That's the West Antarctic ice sheet. And next slide. And that is driven by changes in the ocean heat delivery. The red is basically the temperature at the bottom of the ocean. Around much of Antarctica, you see a little thin blue barrier of cold water that actually insulates the Antarctic from the relatively warm ocean waters. But in the West Antarctic, this warm water is directly in contact with the base of the ice shelves and the ice sheets, driving this excess melting. Next slide, please. And it's in the West Antarctic that this really matters. This reconstruction of the Antarctic ice sheet focuses on the West Antarctic. But if you take the ice away, next slide, you see that a very large amount of this area is actually below sea level. That's the brown. And so as the warm water comes into the contact with the base of the ice shelves and melts it away, it actually reveals more, not less ice to melt, and can actually have accelerating consequences, leading to dynamic feedbacks in the ice and potentially rapid collapse. Next slide. And this has huge potential consequences for sea level rise. This is a plot from the IPCC Assessment Report 6, showing future projections to the end of this century of sea level rise globally, based on different climate scenarios. The blue is strong mitigation, Paris-typical emission scenarios, and the red is strong emissions. And so you have a range of around 50 centimetres to 1 metre of sea level rise. But these critically do not take into account these dynamic feedbacks between the ocean and the ice sheet and the potential for rapid collapse. Our models simply don't include them, and we don't have the necessary understanding or observations to do so in the models. So to take into account of it, basically an expert survey was solicited, and that resulted in that dashed line there showing the potential for things like these rapid ice shelf or ice sheet collapses, leading to a low likelihood but high impact storyline of sea level rises of more than double what is predicted by today's climate models. Next slide. And ice shelves and ice sheets run on longer timescales. So by 2300, that potential maximum sea level rise can't actually be, could be as potentially as high as 15 metres. It can't be excluded. And so this represents the Antarctic and to a lesser extent Greenland represent the biggest uncertainty in our ability to predict future sea level rise. Next slide, please. And this is largely, critically, we have far too few observations of both polar regions, but particularly in the Southern Ocean and particularly around Antarctica. This is the global network of Argo floats that measure the ocean properties. And you can see that in the warm colours, this is where we have good coverage. And around Antarctica in the Southern Ocean, we have very little, and in some areas, none at all. And so this is a huge hole in our observing system and thus our ability to understand and predict the changes in the ice shelves and sheets. Next slide. And that is where ocean ice comes in. Next slide, please. So ocean ice is a large program involving observations and models looking at the interaction, trying to understand how heat is delivered to these ice shelves and the processes that go on beneath them that drive this melting. Next slide, please. We intend to improve our models of the last 40 years or so of Antarctic melt to understand the freshwater that has been put into the system so far. And next slide, then use our improved understanding of the dynamics of the ice shelves and the potential dynamic feedbacks to project forward into the next 300 years and to really try and reduce this uncertainty in future freshwater from the Antarctic ice sheet, future melt and sea level rise. Next slide. Taking these improved estimates, we want to run them through ocean and climate models to ultimately predict, next slide please, the impact of these dynamic ice sheet and shelf changes on the metrics that we really care about, so things like global mean temperature and global sea level rise. And ultimately, next slide please, communicate that to climate assessments such as the IPCC and policymakers such as here. Next slide please. So this program has only been going for a year, and in fact we are now in the process of actually doing our first field season. Some photos on the right show observations from last week, in fact. From on the top there, you can see basically a robot being taken underneath an Antarctic ice shelf in the West Antarctic. And below, another method of assessing changes beneath the ice shelves is hot water drilling. So we've drilled straight through the shelf and measuring the changes beneath it. And these are part of a suite of modelling and other observations, including novel uses of these observing robots, basically being deployed around the periphery of Antarctica, heavily supported by supporting nations such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Norway, Germany, South Korea, and South Africa. Basically allowing us to extend our observing network and using satellites critically, working with ESA, to try and tie these disparate observations together. Next slide, please. So ocean ice will ultimately produce new projections of sea level rise and new assessments of polar tipping point risks, so the potential for these rapid feedbacks and collapses of ice shelves, and the potential knock-on they may have to things like the Atlantic meridional overturning. New observations underneath different sorts of ice shelves to inform these models, and critically improve data management and data sharing across networks, particularly bringing in Copernicus, EMODNet, and the Southern Ocean Observing System. Improvements to regional and global climate models, basically bringing in these ocean ice interactions, and the first projections of global climate indices with these active ice sheets as part of the model. And finally, directly collaborating with regional modelers and policymakers to influence long-term planning and also to drive forward our observing efforts. So final slide, please. So takeaways from this really is that the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic and the interactions between these are really disproportionately important for future climate and sea level rise in particular. Both are critically under-observed and they lack structured observing systems, and there's a real need for policy to drive forward observations and improvements to our modelling infrastructure to reduce these critical uncertainties and deliver results for climate assessments and to society. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. I'm going to take over from Ilias, thank you. We're very happy that we have some fantastic speakers for our panel discussion today. I'd like to introduce Elisabeth Belsi, who is the head of the unit of the Healthy Ocean and Seas, and she'll be our first speaker. Before you start, I would like to also introduce Clara Ganslands, who is the Special Envoy for Arctic Matters at the European External Action Service, and Inutak Holm-Olsen from Greenland, who is part of the representation to the EU. And thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to ask Elisabeth to kick off the panel discussion and give some comments.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody, and many, many thanks to the Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development for organizing this event on a topic which is very strategic and very timely for our policies and for our actions. And I can speak here on behalf of Research and Innovation Actions, and even a bit beyond that, because our initiatives start from research and innovation and cut across all different policies. But I would like to start by quoting actually our commissioner, Iliana Ivanova, who participated in the Polar Summit in Paris in November last year. And she mentioned that without a healthy and integral ocean and cryosphere, humanity and the planet cannot thrive. And we gathered at the Polar Summit not only to discuss, but to act. So to come back to your highlighting the importance of acting, and let us safeguard the most vulnerable components of our planet. And indeed, we heard from our excellent projects, Arctic Passion and Ocean Ice, how serious is the situation and what urgency is there really to act. And I can say that from the research and innovation prospect, we support, so Europe is a major global player in polar sciences. And in the EU Research Innovation Programme, we support a very important portfolio of projects. Today we had examples of 2 excellent projects. But overall, in the current framework program, Horizon Europe, and the previous one, Horizon 2020, we supported nearly 140 projects on the Arctic only, and with investment of more than 370 million euros. And in Antarctica, 55 projects with 150 million euros. Some of the projects are also cross poles. And so this is already a very, very important investment. In addition to that, we have now an important initiative, which is a mission to restore our ocean and waters, with an important lighthouse dedicated to the Atlantic and the Arctic. And to give an example of the activities that we support through this mission, our President Ursula von der Leyen committed at One Ocean Summit to deliver the EU digital twin of the ocean by this year. So there is a very high expectation. And we just launched, well, we have a series of projects, a very important portfolio of projects on the digital twin of the ocean, but we just launched also one specifically on the digital twin of the Arctic. So this within our Sustainable Blue Economy Partnership, which is a partnership between the European Commission and member states and associated countries. And we just launched this project just to give an example how relevant it is, this issue of course, observation, understanding, and then from this passing to the services, and also the concept of having this driven by the local community at the service of the local community. The indigenous community, as you heard from our projects, are a very, very important element of our research and innovation actions. We have also other important initiatives that I would like to mention, international ones. Our honorable member of the parliament mentioned also the importance of connecting, for example, to US and Canada. We have an All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, where we are aligning our efforts with all the partners from all sides of the Atlantic, from pole to pole. So here we have a two poles dimension. And we have, of course, we are collaborating with US, Canada, but Brazil, South Africa, all the countries facing the Atlantic, and with a particular attention also on the poles. We also have a very important cooperation with European Space Agency, with polar flagships, so the EU polar flagships, the one which are supported by the European Space Agency. And so we have this EU polar clusters collaboration, and we will also have a joint European Polar Science Week later in September this year. Another important coordination initiative that I would like to mention is EU Polar Net, which is the world's largest community of expertise and of infrastructure in polar sciences. So we are supporting this. We are ready to support the second phase, which will also support a European Polar Coordination Office. This is just to give you a flavor of the activities that we are supporting. And so this is really a key element of our research and innovation activities, just as an introduction.
Thank you very much. Clara Dansland, Special Envoy for Arctic Matters, would you like to introduce yourself and give some thoughts to the panel?
Yes, absolutely. And as also Elisabetta Balcer was saying, I also want to express my gratitude to the hosts and the organizers for this event, and for you who presented these two very important projects, because it really is very important to raise awareness about the critical importance of the Arctic and Antarctica, not only for the regions, but for all of us. I know we don't have that much time, so I will, if you allow, just very quickly in a nutshell speak about EU Arctic policy, but I understand that you also have prepared a number of questions, so then we can move over to those very quickly. Just to recall then that during the past 2 decades, the EU has gradually developed an Arctic policy. And this we set out most recently in this policy document, which we call the joint communication from the High Representative and the Commission, which was adopted at the end of 2021. And in a nutshell, this Arctic policy sets out that in all our engagement from the Commission and the External Action Service, we work to contributing towards a safe, stable, sustainable and prosperous Arctic. And the focus is on climate change, safeguarding the environment, sustainable development, as well as international cooperation. And across all of these areas, we really put a lot of emphasis and highlight on the importance of science, research, and innovation. So again, very important to make this cross reading that we do here today. And other important areas in the Arctic policy is concerns then indigenous peoples, security and safety issues, and sustainable development. So I'll stop here now, but I'm very happy to take questions from you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that's a really good point to introduce our final speaker on the panel, Ibnutek Holm Olsen. Please give us your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also to the organizers for inviting me, and especially also our president, EBCD. You have heard both some, I mean, from the research community and the policy community here. If I were to describe myself, I would represent those who are the object and the subject of those, research projects. So, and, we have also some, you could say, some things to say and things that we want to see improved. First of all, I mean, you can look at a research project, as it is, to gather information and data and all that. But for us, it's much more than that. Whenever you see researchers coming to Greenland, we want them to be rooted in Greenland. We want to, have the benefits also, have a spillover effect in terms of the research gathered, in terms of the new knowledge, that's been created to also come to the benefit, for example, to Greenland. Which is also why, we, the Greenland government created this strategy, research strategy that was published in January 23, where, I think the overall aim is to have a better rooted research that's being done in Greenland, but also to create better synergies and better relations between the researchers and both local communities and the research institutions in Greenland. Even, it was mentioned in the introduction because of the, the war in Ukraine, researchers in the Arctic can't do any research in Russia right now. So a lot of it has also shifted, which is also some of the effects that we can feel, in Greenland. So, I'll stop here, but we'll continue with the discussions, I think, but this is some of the issues that we would like to raise, from a Greenlandic side.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we're still working out the electronics of the system here. Thank you. We will have a panel discussion now, and Michael has got some questions, and I have some questions, and I'm sure the audience has got some questions. I'm sure Andrew also has many questions after what we've heard today. I will dive in and ask one very clearly of Elisabetta first, and then we will take it from there. But there will be, of course, time for both people online and people in the room to ask questions too. So please do think about what you would like to know more about. Elisabetta, you've discussed many EU programs in the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's actually quite impressive, the sort of number of policy projects that have been working in the Arctic and the Antarctic. But it's also clear that there's a difference in how the EU deals with the Arctic and the Antarctic, and I work in both polar regions. What do you see are the major policy differences between the engagement in the Arctic and the Antarctic for the EU? And what initiatives can we do to bring these closer together? I mentioned, I think, that we are looking at the Arctic and the Antarctic, and we can really see a lot of similarities between these. And how can we benefit from that?
Thank you very much. this question. And indeed, both poles from the research and innovation point of view of the European Commission are extremely important. I mentioned some numbers and highlighted the importance of a portfolio of both regions. Of course, we had more on the Arctic, a bit less in Antarctica, but clearly the strategic importance of both is clear. I'm speaking from the science part, and then I'm sure you will complement from the policy part. And we are seeing also from the projects how both poles will actually directly impact on our future and over the future of the whole globe. So the investment is very important in both. We are also planning to continue to invest and possibly increase investments on both poles. We also connect, even though recognizing the difference and the specificity, but we also have activities which connect. For example, our All Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance now is from pole to pole, so it's really also this connection, connectivity dimension. Also, our activities like EU PolarNet is also connecting the expertise in the infrastructure from both poles. The EC, the cooperation with the European Space Agency, also has this connection dimension. So for us, they are both important. They are different and with specificity that we recognize. We are investing and planning to invest, hopefully also increasingly on both poles. And we are also very much supporting connecting activities to have the largest impact and also to act quickly, because we know that time is really now a big constraint. So we really need to join forces and be effective as fast as possible.
Thank you very much. Michael, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Alfred. Yeah, I would have a question for Clara Gansland. So my question would be, where would you want Europe or the EU to be placed in 5 years' time regarding Arctic matters? What is the way ahead? And do you believe that all EU institutions have the same goal, matching goals in the Arctic engagement? And are there structures to harmonize this if this is necessary? If this should be necessary?
Thank you very much. And a very important question. So where would I want to see EU to be placed in 5 years' time as regards what we're discussing here today? And I think it's first very important to be mindful about the transformed geographic and geopolitical landscape. So here, as we heard already in the introductions, there are really very important structural factors, and most important, of course, climate change, but also the geopolitical dynamics. Yeah, we heard again here about the Arctic regions warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and the dramatic consequences of climate change on security of local populations, on infrastructure, and also these dramatic consequences on a global scale. But there are also, what we have not talked so much about now today, the opportunities that are also opened up. So new shipping lanes and also access to raw material deposits, for instance. And I'd just like to recall that, for instance, in a report which was issued by the Joint Research Center in the Science for Policy series, it was mentioned that there will be countries profiting from climate change in the Arctic region, and also risks for more competition and so forth. So many factors on the outside that we need to keep in mind for what we have in 5 years' time. Now, focusing specifically on climate change. So 5 years from now, that means 1 year from the European 2030 environmental and climate and energy targets, which are then also, of course, key to our Arctic engagement. And here, European Arctic could play a key role as a provider of renewable energy and a reliable supplier of critical raw materials. These are, of course, fundamental to achieving our climate goals and also our energy independence from Russia. But then again, this needs investments, and it needs to take into account work going on EU strategic autonomy, on economic security, and other things. Personally, I would also hope in 5 years' time that the push for oil, coal, and gas to stay in the ground that we mentioned in the joint communication, that this has been effective, and that we have a viable, realistic, and inclusive green transition well underway. I also hope that international regulations on black carbon emissions have been implemented, and in a concerted effort to strengthen the albedo effect. And I would like the Arctic file to be more included in the EU's debate on climate security, this nexus between climate and security that the Commission and the High Representative highlighted in also a joint communication in June this year, which looks at how to address the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on peace, security, and defense. Another important point, which I hope we will have in 5 years' time, is on sustainable development. And I hope that projects will have provided the people living in the Arctic with better opportunities, green jobs, infrastructure, and also help to face social, educational, and business challenges. And here I hope, for instance, concretely, that initiatives like our recently launched Arctic Urban and Regional Cooperation Program, which is supporting 15 Arctic local authorities from Finland, Sweden, Norway, Greenland, Iceland, Canada, that this will contribute to this. This is about peer-to-peer learning, sharing experiences and best practices. And also I would want to have a strengthening of dialogue and cooperation with regional actors, including Arctic local communities and indigenous people. And it's crucial for the EU to be seen as an Arctic actor advancing regional interests and values and norms. I want to see in 5 years' time a strong cooperation with like-minded partners and concretely, for instance, increased strategic foresight, closer cooperation with Norway, Iceland, US, Canada, NATO, and others. And also that the ongoing transformation in the Arctic regions will be intense, and that the EU will keep supporting Arctic players and stakeholders, so that this transformation, which will take place, is positive and benefits those living in the Arctic. So I want to believe that by 2029, we are on track to securing a more peaceful, stable, and prosperous Arctic region, which are the objectives that we set out in our joint communication. And for this, we need awareness raising. So I come back to the point made in the beginning, how important it is that we here in a broader circle together from all kinds of aspects try to raise awareness about what the impacts of climate change and the changes mean for the Arctic, but also outside. And that we have adequate political attention, that we regularly can assess and ensure that we have policies that are fit for purpose, and also that we have then the adequate resources to make the policies become reality, and that we then are better prepared for the changes that will come. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clara. So we go on with questions from Ruth to Imotech.
Thank you. And I think this is actually a really good introduction. Thank you to what we would like to hear more about from Institut here. So you've already mentioned your national research strategy, and I think I've read it a few months ago, and I think it's a really important that it's emphasized that science in Greenland should be a benefit to Greenlandic people, which is, I think, extremely important also for other people who live in the Arctic. And Clara mentioned stability, prosperity, green jobs, those kind of things. How do you see the national research strategy do you think there's room for that to support these kind of initiatives in Greenland? And how can the EU better support those initiatives in Greenland as well?
No, thank you. I mean, yeah, to respond to your question, I think we should also look at, the EU-Greenland relations, because there are some elements actually in that relationship where we are getting some funding, to develop the green energy sector, for example, to transition, as Europe is also doing these years. But coming back to the issue of the research strategy, as I mentioned, we want to see better engagement, with the research community that's coming in, from the outside, so to speak, and to engage both with the local communities, but also with our research institutions that we have established, and to, work better, because it is important that we're not only an object but also a subject, because Greenland is very dependent, for example, on fisheries and what's going on in the oceans. So that's also one of the objectives of the strategy, is to have greater focus on the ocean component, and the knowledge that's being created can have effects and benefits, in the policy-making, decision-making process, but also in making appropriate decisions that are important. For example, if you found out certain things about what's going on in the ocean, but also, Arctic Passion has also described the engagement with people in Greenland, and also see that in the information provided, that's also an important component. So a better, so basically, we would like to see more of, what's a very basic principle, that, that you treat each other with respect wherever you go. That's only, in terms of research, is, normal conduct, I would think, in wherever we go, whoever we are, and to have better inclusion of, and be better, have a better awareness of where you are, and to share that information with wherever you go, be it in Greenland or other places. Because one of the differences between Arctic and Antarctic is that you won't hear any complaints, if you go to the Antarctic. As opposed, to the Arctic, where you have to, I guess, make a bigger effort to, to try to connect with people who lived, around where you're conducting your research.
Yeah, we could since you're online. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I mentioned that already when we were talking briefly before. So one of the things which is at the heart of Arctic Passion work, or some of the Arctic Passion work, is how to make sure that needs of local communities, local population, is conveyed to those organizations which are doing Arctic research and Arctic observations. And do we have the proper communication channels for this established? And if not, what, from a Greenlandic perspective, what would you suggest, or what would you formulate as a wish for the future, how this could be shaped so that it's most useful for a two-way exchange of needs, of information, of data between the local population and the research and observation community.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, in the strategy that we have developed, there are a set of initiatives, and I mean, there are many, but one of them, but we also have to prioritize. And one of the priorities is to develop, for example, a research portal, to give a better overview of what's going on, but also to be able to better connect, between research institutions who are conducting research in Greenland, but also with local communities and research institutions there. But also, I mean, I think from just from a project perspective, in general, I mean, it doesn't really matter whether this is a research project or not. If you engage with people, I mean, provided, of course, that you have the right connections, if you engage with them from the very onset or the beginning, and not just come, with a finished product, and say, this is your place there. I think that leads to a much better outcome. I mean, that's, I think, in whatever research or just projects that you're working on, that's what we found. I mean, it's can be very, I think, to put it mildly, annoying to be presented with a finished product and say, this is, where you fit in, as opposed to, where you work with people from the very beginning.
Thanks. I think Andrew would like to ask a question now. Sorry to interrupt. We could talk about this for a long time.
Thank you, Ruth. This is a question for Elisabetta. So Arctic Passion and Ocean Ice have obviously are projects with great value, but they also have a limited time. And one of the things that we underscored in both our presentations was the lack of observations in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And that lack of a long-term sustained monitoring infrastructure is something that's really holding science back in these areas. So how does the European Commission plan to tackle these challenges of maintaining such long-term networks beyond the lifetime of finite projects?
Thank you very much, Andrew. And this is indeed a very important challenge. And by the way, a challenge which applies in general, I would say, to the ocean science, because we can say that roughly only 30% of the observing system benefit from a sustainable funding system, while all the rest, it's systems which are to short-term programs and grants, which sometimes even interrupted. So this is indeed an issue. Now, at EU level, I think we have quite a strong track record of keeping an important coordination and supporting system, also with a long-term perspective. I just mentioned now the Digital Twin of the Ocean project, which in fact is not one project, is gathering for the moment more than 50 projects, only to mention let's say our research innovation project, but it's really an initiative which is service-oriented, which will involve the society at large, policymakers. So this is an example. Then we have several joint programming initiatives, different projects which contribute to this. And also, for example, I'm also pleased to announce that we will soon launch the new research infrastructure POLARIN, which will provide transnational access to over 50 polar research infrastructure for impactful research projects. So this is some examples of how we are not only supporting single excellent projects like yours, but also all the coordination activities of this. Then, of course, it's also very important our engagement and collaboration and partnership, not only with the countries, but also in the international context. I mentioned some initiatives. Also, the UN Ocean Decade offers a very important opportunity. We also act very much in this framework. And also, it's high on the agenda of the G7 this year in Italy. I think there is an important focus on the ocean, on the digital, and there it's also a frame where we can join forces really for global efforts, which are long-term as much as possible. Thank you.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Elżbieta. If I may add on to this or continue this a little bit, you mentioned the not the mismatch, but let's say the relationship of long-term funded observations versus short-term funded observations. And we all know for any climate change related issues, we need those long-term observations, we need long time series, we need coordinated observations. And as you say, a lot of that is still funded by short-term research projects. So are there any concrete discussions in the EU or the Commission which think about how this could be put on a sustainable long-term track for those observations which then are identified as essential, like essential climate variables or others? Is there any concept for this in the discussion right now to move it from research funded to, I don't know, Copernicus or whatever systems or services?
Yes, I would like also to mention, by the way, that there is a colleague of mine, very knowledgeable here, Franz Himmler, who is managing a very large part of his portfolio. So please, Franz, feel free to intervene. But for sure, beyond this very large portfolio that I mentioned in those initiatives, which go beyond, of course, we are bound by budgetary cycles. So we have a multi-annual financial program. So there we have time constraints. But still, nevertheless, I think the history and the track record shows that we have initiatives like the joint program initiatives, the partnerships, which are, there is a path which is longer than one program cycle. And also in these initiatives, I just gave the example of a digital twin of the ocean. You see that there is, even if there is an urgency also, because we need really to deliver in a very short time. Now we were asked 2 years ago to deliver the digital twin of the ocean this year. So it's quite, there are also time constraints. But I think in the type of instruments that we are using, a wide range of instruments, we also have reflected this sort of need of continuation, even though the projects have a certain duration and the programs have a certain duration. But overall, there is long-term visibility, certainly for research and innovation. Franz, please feel free to complement if you like.
If I have to, because thanks for that opportunity, but indeed it's a critical question. It's not an easy one. And I think what we can do, since we run the framework program Horizon Europe, which is dedicated to provide project funding and not long-term funding, it's a difficult nut to chew on for us. I think that, but there are also good examples also within Horizon, and one is the infrastructure program. We have managed a few. Actually, I was just thinking, I'm not sure to what extent you looked into S3 and opportunities to push some of those observing systems within S3 to make it a long-term research infrastructure. I think also we need to collaborate probably more with member states, because it's at the end of the day, the ones who run the long-term infrastructures, and AVI is a strong player in this, and some others are funded through member states. So we need to probably get the member states more around the table and say, okay, let's look, how can we support what has been developed in the projects more on the long term, but the funding needs to come from member state sources or from other sources than Horizon. We cannot fund it on long term through Horizon money, at least not from what we do, cluster 5, cluster 6, because that will always be project funding. And so that's just some ideas of what you can look into, or we can collectively look into how to tackle this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Franz. Something to discuss further at another occasion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a long discussion, and it's one I recognize a lot from the meteorological institutes, which also very much have these discussions. It's I think we would all like to have some more questions from the floor. I have one question I would like to end on, at least from our point of view, to Clara. Do you believe there's any appetite or room to create a special envoy for the Antarctic? Would you like to become the sort of EU representative for Antarctic matters as well as Arctic matters?
Yeah, thank you very much for raising this. And also, I read with a lot of interest this in-depth analysis, which have been commissioned by the European Parliament. It's called Antarctica, What Role for the European Union? And it gives a lot of very interesting recommendations, including what you raise now, that the EU should appoint a special envoy for the Antarctic as well. I think we heard today about the crucial impact of what happens in the Antarctic region for us here and for the globe. Also speaking under the control again of Elisabetta, I know there is a very big Antarctic portfolio on research and development side. But if I may, I think it would be important before appointing such a special envoy, first to reflect really on what would be the overall objective of a policy framework of the EU for Antarctica, and also what role would the EU take regarding the future of Antarctic governance in the changing global geopolitical setting, etc. So to really think it through. And personally, I also agree very much what is said in this in-depth analysis paper, which recommends actually not to conflate, not to combine the Antarctic and the Arctic poles, because the challenges faced either are actually unique. So I personally do believe that there needs to be a dedicated expertise to the regions to reflect that. I mean, as Inutech also were mentioning, in the Arctic, of course, there are people, vibrant, living places, you know, where people have their everyday lives. They go to school, they need infrastructure, they need healthcare, etc. And in the Antarctica, that's not. I mean, it's not the same issues that we are facing. So I think that the in-depth analysis is very right when it says that the Antarctic is distinct from the Arctic. And also it points to the fact that the relationship between Arctic states and their northern communities is radically different to Antarctica that does not have an indigenous human population.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd have one last question, and that would go to all three of our panelists in a way. So, Inutech, you have been mentioning the importance of involving indigenous and local population from the very start on. And we have realized in conversations with our partners that this is often a funding problem, simply. I mean, if we want to involve someone from a local or indigenous community, say, in a project proposal, we need to have money to pay them for this time they are spending. They have no permanent jobs or even part-time jobs sometimes in science, like we do mostly. So the question is, what is the vision? Are there any conversations between, for example, Greenland and the EU on how this can be incorporated in a better way in future funding schemes, so that payment of indigenous and local population, which is an explicit wish of the EU also in the Arctic policy, as I understand it, how this can be better realized from a financial point of view? Is there anything in the pipeline which we can look forward to, maybe?
Can try to start. So certainly, and you have demonstrated it with your projects, with your excellent projects, that the involvement of indigenous communities in the projects, in these specific projects particularly, is a key element of our program. So it's clearly recognized. And also, I would say the involvement of the communities in the projects as at large, it's also a very important element or distinguishing feature of our program. Now, so the indigenous knowledge holders are part of a scientific community, which is coordinated also by the EU Polar Net. So there we also try to help this, this element. You have seen also how, also our knowledge system and monitoring system, including the DTO, is also very much counting on the participation of the communities to feed the system and to benefit from the system. So this is also very important driving principle of our initiatives. And then maybe to give an example of how we are helping is in our work program 2024, there is now a topic on participation and empowerment of Arctic, coastal, local and indigenous communities in environmental decision making. So it's clear that even in the topics, subjects and titles, this is a clear element. Then if there are administrative issues, we are also open to listen to that and see how this can be solved. But I would say clearly the indigenous communities are a key part of this type of activities.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that you're raising, but and it should probably be raised, at a higher level, but because I haven't seen it. But at the same time, I think this is not only a Greenlandic, issue. It's an issue that's been raised and debated in the Arctic Council, for example, between the indigenous, the permanent representatives and the member states for years and years and years. How to better include, but also respect local knowledge and indigenous knowledge that in the research projects that are being conducted, because I think one of the basic principles that we think it's to be truth is that especially those living off hunting or fishing, they have knowledge that's been drawn to them for generations, and therefore that's also an important component. I think that that's been respected, and recognized now by a wide range of research institutions, including in the European Union. But how to, address that particular issue that you raise, I think that's something that could be debated, but I don't know if there's, one size fits all kind of a solution to this issue, because sometimes, one size fits none, but that's to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. So I can see we have about 15 minutes before we have to close down discussions, and actually we have much less time because we have some closing remarks. I can see there's one question online. Are there any questions in the room that people would like to pose to any of us here? Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting discussion. A couple of the speakers mentioned the importance of collaboration with North Americans, especially the US. And I know for a while that the EU and the US have tried to bring together some type of agreement where we can work closer together on science. So I'm just wondering, is there any fruit coming out of those discussions? Because they've been going on for so many years, and as a scientist, you can see, I think one of the successes of the EU is bringing together all that knowledge from many, many countries when you're trying to tackle a challenge as broad as climate change, and certainly bringing that out to the US and bringing some of those US scientists on an equal equal setting in a proposal front would be really, really welcome.
Certainly. Thank you very much for this question. And indeed, we have very important collaborations, also some dedicated ones. I mentioned the All Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance and their Research Innovation Alliance. And there we really are bringing together the communities. Let's say in that case, it's mainly the scientific and research innovation community, and to address together have joint efforts for main challenges. Polar sciences are, by the way, an important topic there for joint efforts. And also, we just had a forum in South Africa last November, and the final statement was that we would focus on some, let's say, areas, including the resilience of coastal communities. So here you find back the mentioning of the communities, and this is really a joint effort where the US and the EU are joining efforts. Since 10 years, we celebrated last year the 10 years anniversary. This is just an example. Then, of course, our program is open to collaboration, and we have this type of collaboration throughout the program. But this is a dedicated initiative which is very successful. We did, for example, seabed mapping together, and now this. And the issue of data and observation is the second key focus areas which has been identified, together with the resilience of coastal communities. So we will have further actions in this direction.
Yeah, that sounds really, really positive, because what I've seen from the science front, especially in the polar science sphere, that we have from the individual science front, we really, really want to work with our US colleagues. And we do that bilaterally within nations, but it's been really challenging to do that from the within an EU project. And the EU projects, in my opinion, are so much broader, and the challenges we're dealing with, like we said, with ocean ice or Arctic pasture, are so broad. They can only be done by bringing many, many nations together. And it's that last stumbling. I just don't see, in all my EU projects involved in, it's been very challenging to bring US colleagues on in an equal basis as we would, say, an Italian and a French and a German colleague together. And that's where, as a scientist, I'd like to see that those barriers diminished for sure.
Absolutely.
I think we have one question online. I think we maybe have just enough time to take that. Would either you or Regina like to read it out?
Thank you so much, Ruth. So the question reads, as a space law PhD candidate focused on the intersection of Earth and space activities, I'm intrigued by the potential establishment of commercial spaceports in the Arctic. Given the delicate environmental balance in the region, how can policymakers ensure that the development and operation of these spaceports not only adhere to terrestrial sustainability goals, but also contribute to the broader principles of space sustainability, considering, of course, the unique challenges and opportunities presented by the Arctic environment? I understand it's an open question for panelists.
I think it's a very interesting question. I must admit, I didn't even know that space law was a thing. So that's quite an exciting, fast-moving area. I think it touches on a lot of subjects which also our introductory remarks from Urmas Paet were touching on, about how the polar regions are starting to become areas where we also have energy issues and sustainability issues and legal and geopolitical issues. So it's a really interesting question. I would like to make one comment, and that is, I don't think it was you, Andrew, but it was one of your colleagues I actually had a teleconference with whilst you were in Antarctica, thanks to Starlink. And I think we should probably not underestimate how that's going to change work in the polar regions, this ability to have fast communications. And I know Inutek was talking to some colleagues in northern Greenland, and they can't wait to get Starlink. It's going to change life completely for people in the Arctic. So I think it's a really interesting question to think about going forward. Did anybody have any specific comments on that question? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, more like a question. What are the EU plans regarding communications in the Arctic? Because Starlink is a US company.
Do you intend communication at large? Communication? Again, I can only speak on behalf of, let's say, of the research and innovation part of EU programs. And there, for us, communication is a key element. And the communication is, it's involving the communities and engaging the communities. Maybe I expand on the point of the community, I take the opportunity to expand on the point of the communities, because we have also actions right now ongoing, including within our mission, where we have a lighthouse from the Atlantic and the Arctic, really to not only to engage the communities, but to serve the communities and to provide them with services in order to implement a transition in their local contexts. So we are really offering services to the local communities for local communities developed actions in order to implement a transition, the Green Deal transition, or the transition that we are promoting in our mission to restore our ocean and water, so to regenerate the oceans and the inland waters in the local context. And so this goes far beyond the research innovation classical projects, which are key for us, but we also have this type of services. So we are not only making communicating, we are engaging, and we are making them become actors of a transition. So we are enabling them to become actors of the transitions in their own local context, in function of their needs, in function of their capacities. So I wanted to mention this because it starts from communication, is key for us, but we go far beyond communication, really engagement and enabling and empowering the communities, also through our framework program of research innovation and our mission, where we hope, by the way, that everybody is joining. We really need the support of all the actors, all the institutions, and to make it happen. And the polar regions are a key element of this. So thank you for joining us in this common endeavor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Balzi, for your reply. And I see that the person asking the question online gave us a thumbs up and commented that I'm glad you find my question interesting and it sparks such an interesting debate. There is just some very brief follow-up questions. It's the final ones coming from the platform. There is one for Greenland. I guess it's an easy one. It's quoting, what's the best way of reaching Greenland with project recommendations and news? I guess if we can have this question over an email, we can put you in contact bilaterally. Okay, saying Inutech nodding, I guess we can do that. But
I would also like to suggest the Arctic Hub, which is a really great resource for researchers who want to work in Greenland.
And the last question is, given that everyone talks about the need to raise awareness of the poles, what are some effective methods of doing this in your experience? And maybe with a reply on this, we can move to Mr. Paet's closing remarks.
Well, I can start. I think we should use all channels, all methods, and this meeting today is one. Also through awareness raising with young generations in Europe, in schools and so forth, decision makers, blogs, X, you name it. I don't think we can be very exclusive here. It's all of it. Thank you.
Maybe I can add an invitation to participate to the second European Polar Science Week in Copenhagen in September. Of course, it's dedicated to specific aspects, but still will be very broad and an important moment to give visibility of the strategic importance of this area.
And I apologize to come back, but I then also, it reminds me, I should also then make some publicity from the EU Arctic Forum, which will come here in May in Brussels, which is our important event every year to really raise awareness and have a platform. So EU Arctic Forum and Indigenous Peoples Dialogue.
Well, thank you very much for your replies. I guess this wraps up the panel discussion and the Q&A session with the audience. So on this note, on behalf of the Secretariat of the Intergroup, I'm very happy to thank you all for joining us today. And I'll give the floor back to MEP Mr. Urmas Paet, then, host of today's event, for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you. This is what we just heard about raising awareness. Of course, this is actually the key also for hopefully common sense-based decisions for the future. Although, unfortunately, what we also witnessed during the last few years here in Europe is that well, the raising awareness is very much linked to the fact that if already something bad happens, so that I guess still in polar issues, including Arctic issues, we still have the chance to be a bit more faster in decision makings and also actions before really something bad happens. Because if you look at some other fields, be it pandemia, be it security, be it energy, we see here this classical bad human pattern that yes, we start to really move and change things if already, well, shock is there or something bad happened. And there are all signs that something like this may also happen with polar areas, with Arctic as well. So that I guess one of the strong elements for increasing awareness is to avoid this kind of negative scenario for increasing this awareness. And then that's why I guess, of course, we all like to see that all the steps and decisions are common sense based or fact based or knowledge based, science based, and so on and so on. But well, our everyday life is more diverse. It means that there are also emotions, there are also, well, social media with everything in it, and so on and so on. And of course, this year there are also two major political and well, society events here in Europe and also in America. European Parliament elections with the consequences, and presidential elections in the US with consequences. And I would say already today that both these events will also have impact on Arctic and maybe also Antarctica policies. So that everything is linked to everything. And that's why I guess that also the attempt should be that when we speak about Arctic and polar developments, we try to show to our societies larger picture, how the impact is to Arctic, to polar areas, and also vice versa. How is the impact to other regions and parts in Europe, but also globally from Arctic if something really goes wrong, and then of course also what are then the steps we should and can do. So that with this happy note, I thank you very much, participants. Thank you for your passion, as it is, Arctic passion, and of course of your knowledge. And I guess that next to conferences, next to, well, scientific events, of course, the more we all together can explain what is happening to the wider audience, the better it is in final end. So that once again, thank you very much. And I really hope that also after 10 and 20 years, we can enjoy in Estonia ice roads during the winter, driving over the sea, as it used to be all last hundreds or even thousands of years. Thank you very much.